Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Go to shiftingculturepodcast.com to interact or donate. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app to get notified when new episodes drop. And if you're enjoying the show, go leave a rating or review and share this podcast with your friends and network. Previous guests on the show have included Onia Okuwabi, Jesse Cruikshank, and Rob Wegner. You could go back, listen to those episodes, and many, many more. But today's guest is Keri Ladouceur. Keri serves as a pastor in Naperville, Illinois, and is the founder and lead coach at New Ground Network. Her most recent book is Together as a Team. She longs to activate the people of God to join Christ in the redemption and restoration of all things. Keri and I have a great conversation around the church-pacing culture, truly embodying Jesus, giving voice to the marginalized, and the hope that comes in facing reality in the current moment that we are in. Enjoy the show. And here is Keri. Keri, welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited that you decided to join us, so I'm excited to have you here. So thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be with you, Joshua.
Yeah, I'd love to just dive in about where Jesus was made real to you in your own life, where he became a real person and Lord, and not just an idea, but he became real.
Oh, yeah. A couple of things come to mind. I'll try to fly through it. The very first one, when I was a kid, I was probably 9 years old. And actually, we went to a pretty charismatic church service. It was like somebody, my sister's boyfriend or something, his family attended this church. And I had a very real encounter with the Spirit there. And I was marked by that and like wanted my family to all go to church for my birthday when I was little. And
Wow.
there was just something very real and tangible then. And then, the family that I grew up in kind of went to church off and on, but I would say didn't necessarily embody the ways of Jesus. And so I got pretty turned off by the church, just the idea that like, oh, this is what we say and what we read, but this is what we do. They must all be hypocrites. I don't want anything to do with them, really. So I kind of walked away from the church. But then as a young adult, I say I darkened the doors on an Easter Sunday, and the church didn't catch on fire, which was a really good thing because I kind of thought that might happen. At this point in my life, I had kind of tried everything the world had to offer that was going to like make me feel whole or successful or whatever, fill in the blank. And so I was like, I think people go to church on Easter Sunday. And I went to church in my early 20s, had a very real encounter with Jesus there, and really reflected on kind of this invitation to be a child of God and to follow Jesus. And I left there with this passage from Mark 8 about if you want to lose your life, you'll find it. And if you want to find your life, you have to be willing to lose it and find it in me. And I taped it to my bathroom mirror. And every day just tried to ask the question like, okay, what does this mean to lose my life in Christ and live for him? And how should I change how I spend my money, or what I do with my time, or how I engage in relationships, how I run my business at that time. So it that was the first encounter. I could tell you about some other significant ones, but
yeah. As you're navigating that time where you're figuring out, how do I lose my life and find my life in Jesus? What were some of the shifts that you saw in your own life and in your business that said, wow, I need to live differently than I was before?
Yeah. I guess I have to be really honest with you about how I was living before that encounter. So, I was young in my 20s. I had been on my own since I was 16. I made great money. I partied. I worked in the hospitality industry, scaling a restaurant franchise. So, we could go out every night and hang out at different bars. We knew kind of people in the industry. There were some substances that were illegal at the time that I engaged in. I ran a business. The restaurant business could be pretty demanding and vulgar, and there's high turnover rate. And, so it changed. Okay, how do I need to look at my relationships? I was going out on dates all the time and just kind of for fun, I guess. I don't really know what I was doing, but it changed. How was I going to engage in my relationships? What was I going to do in my spare time? I started going to church. Somebody thought it was a good idea to invite me to lead a small group. One of those, like, put the DVD in and push play and put out a snack. And I remember there were things I was like, I wonder if I should put this away before people from church come over to my house. Like I was so
Yeah.
green, and it started impacting. So this restaurant, managed and had a team of managers, and so there was something to them that was very stark, that was
Mm.
different about
Yeah.
me. Um, and I started kind of talking about that. I'll never forget the first time I like prayed out loud with one of my line cooks who was
Mm.
struggling with addiction and having a really hard time and like hit the end of his rope. And so we like went around the corner in dry storage, and I was like, can I pray for you? This is weird,
Yeah.
but several kind of people in that time found their way back to God. There had been a
Mm.
series of hurricanes that hit Florida during this time, and the
Yeah.
church that I was part of wanted to do hurricane relief. And I was like, I have kitchen staff and food access to food. And like I rallied
Mm.
my cooks to show up and do this hurricane relief with like the little old church ladies who were like, what is happening? I didn't know any better. And so as those kind of two parts of my life started to
Mm.
merge, we did start what we called a building better people policy,
Mm-hmm.
where we wanted to invest in our people. We wanted to have a healthy culture in the restaurant industry. We stopped using foul language to one another, to talk to one another with respect. We saw our turnover rate significantly decline because people felt like
Mm.
seen and
Yeah.
respected at work. So, there were really small ways, like I needed Sundays off, and I started to get in a small group and that kind of stuff. And then there were some really big kind of outcomes that came from just every day asking that question and wrestling with the answer.
Mm. And it sounds like it actually impacted the space that you were working in, living in, and it wasn't just a Sunday morning type of faith of saying I'm just going to go on a Sunday morning, and so a lot of times what I've seen the church, particularly in the West at the moment, have either decided to say, I'm going to retreat from culture. I'm not going to engage it because it's unsafe for me, and it's actually going to inflict my children or me with the bad things of the world, which is absolutely opposite of what Jesus did. Is he actually engaged people that were far from God, and he wasn't defiled, but he actually made things whole and
Yeah.
bright and full of light. And so that's one aspect. So let's dive into that. How have you seen churches go from a place of I don't want to engage in culture because it's unsafe for me and my family to we need to engage culture. It's not going to defile me, and we need to be more like Jesus.
Yes. I wish I could remember who said this, but I read this line somewhere that just sticks with me, that love cannot be defiled.
Hmm.
And it was really just about the life and the ways of Jesus. And I'm so captivated with how Jesus chose to live. I think
Yeah.
in this particular cultural moment in the church, my perspective is that people are really wrestling with this. And I think when you kind of pull back the layers of why we even got to this place of needing to fear culture or retreat from it, or kind of sanitize and stay
Yeah.
safe from it, I think that's a lot of really fear-based ways of
Hmm.
experiencing God. And
Yeah.
I think as you start to pull on those threads,
Hmm.
maybe it's disconcerting for people, but the more you kind of pull on that, it's being saved from something instead of being invited to something. I
Hmm.
think there's, you know, maybe even in the faith tradition I grew up in, off and on, there was a lot of shame-based kind of
Yeah.
invitation to what it is that
Hmm.
Jesus came to do, versus I think that, and maybe this is even part of what I experienced in the restaurant industry at that time. I was so captivated with the person of Jesus and the love and the
Hmm.
invitation and the restoration he offered and he embodied. I felt like everybody would want this, like
Yeah.
why
Exactly.
wouldn't they be drawn to somebody like this? I'm so drawn to this. So, I mean, I see a lot of churches, to your point, wrestling with this right now,
Yeah.
churches in the West that maybe inherited sort of a shame-based
Hmm.
or fear-based, or, I mean, even a total depravity view of humanity. But when I go back to Genesis 1 and I see, wait a minute, let's look at God's original intentions,
Yeah.
the way he created us for mutuality and for flourishing and for shalom. And if Jesus came to begin that sort of redemption of all things, then
Hmm.
I think our invitation as Christ followers is active participation in the
Yeah.
redemption and restoration of those things. So I feel like there's maybe it's subtle, but it's very distinct sort of shift in what the invitation even is to follow Jesus that
Mm.
my deep prayer is that churches are really wrestling through right now.
Yeah. So how do we activate the church and followers of Jesus to get them into a place to be actively pursuing the redemption and restoration of all things to God?
Yeah. Oh man. Okay. You just said my life's mission statement is to activate the people of God to join Christ in the redemption and restoration of all things. Like,
There you go.
how do we do that? I mean, I think at a very basic fundamental level, those of us that teach and preach God's word have to be interrogating what are those kind of messages or theologies that we might have brought into this? What are the paradigms that we're operating in about what the church is, right? So you talk about the church in the West. I have experience working in a mega church in the West that probably impacted every church in the West, even in ways they might not be aware of.
Right.
And I have had to interrogate those models of success, those, I would propose, colonialized models of what leadership looks like and hierarchy. And as I've had to kind of take those apart and say, wait a minute, let's go back to the text. Let's go back to the life of Jesus. Let's go back to the movement that he came to catalyze. We've gotten off course on a couple of these things. So I think maybe we start there is interrogating what is it we're actually inviting people into? What is it that we're doing here? You know, and I would propose this last 2 years of COVID has held up a mirror to us. It's been given us the gift of illumination. And I think many of us are like, oh, as we look in the mirror, maybe what's reflected back to us is off from what we think we're really supposed to be. And so this is the time for us to pivot and reimagine what is it that Christ is doing in the world right now, and how do we not need to be the conduit of that, but how can we just be a catalyst for other people to get engaged in that? And that really should challenge our paradigms of what church has looked like in the last, right?
Yeah, that challenges a lot. And so if we're looking at something where it was, based on probably charisma of a vision leader saying, I'm going to rally around something and we're going to go for it. And taking a lot of different models from the business world or others to say, we want to grow something in a spectacular way, and measuring that as our impact of what does growth look like. What is the difference there? Jesus worked with a few to impact the many. And there was a place for the crowds, and there was a place where, he was engaging with the crowds, but most of his ministry in his life was with the 3 or the 12. How do we shift our paradigms to start to look more like Jesus's ministry and embodying Jesus, instead of saying, I just want to rally around the person, the main head leader?
Yeah. I have two thoughts on that. One might be really stretching. I don't know. We'll see. The first one I really think is when you look at the life and ministry of Jesus, which I do think we have a lot to learn from and take from. He consistently pointed to the work of God's kingdom, right? He consistently talked about, like, yes, this is what I'm doing, but I'm just doing the work of God's kingdom. There's a much bigger thing happening here than just this one thing I'm doing. And I think we could take the lead on that as pastors, right? This is not about me or what I'm doing or a charismatic message or a compelling thought or idea. This is about the work of God's kingdom breaking in the rule and reign of Christ here and now.
Yeah.
And that those things that Jesus did, those are just the beginning of the kind of culmination of what's coming and of the work he invited us into. So we could take some cues from Jesus on, how he talked about something even much bigger than himself, which, what he did is pretty remarkable.
Right.
In my own journey of this, of kind of reimagining the paradigm or just taking apart some of the things that formed me, I do think the faith that was purported here into the Americas has shaped us in ways that we're not totally aware of. It shaped our thinking. It shaped, obviously our economic system and capitalism, but the colonial idea of kind of this singular leader that's going to rally a bunch of people, and we're going to build something big, and we're going to build empire. All of those things I think are really threaded together. And I, even after reading and studying some kind of Black theology about the God of the oppressed and who Jesus actually moves towards, I am deeply challenged by the idea that maybe we build these platforms because we might think that that's a more compelling story to people than the way of Jesus. I think there's just something there that we have to wrestle with right now.
Yeah. More compelling, or, maybe it's easier than the way of Jesus for us. That it's an easier way, and it's not as challenging. The way of Jesus is hard and difficult and very challenging to go after and to be one with the oppressed and the marginalized, the neglected, and the margins of society, to turn the society upside down. And we, especially those that have power, want to keep power, and even subconsciously, they want to keep power. And I think a lot of times it's not overt, it's just subconscious, and they don't realize it. But because of that, that's how they shape what is. And so what are some practical ways that we could start to just take steps of obedience to engage with the oppressed and not just be on stage for our own glory?
Okay, so again, kind of two things come to mind. I think the first one, even when we say the idea of stewarding power or holding power, I think we have to actually name some of the ways that plays out, right? For people that might be listening that are like, I'm pretty good with my power. I don't tell my wife what to do, or I don't tell my kids what to do, right? Like, I think I've heard Diane Langberg talk about different types of power, like even the way our systems prop up hierarchy when it comes to gender or ethnicity, racial hierarchy between men and women. We have to be aware of that. And I'm not even talking in the church. I'm talking like within culture, right? In how men and women are projected in movies, or in how we experience a woman in a position of power. I have had to wrestle with, like, at one point, I wondered if a male doctor might be smarter, who would I prefer work on my car, or how do we experience women judges, like there's lots of ways that we have to wrestle with our ideas about power. Or people who stand on a stage, they hold rhetorical power to be able to use words to move people. They probably hold educational power if they have a seminary degree. There's spiritual and emotional power when you get up on a stage and you're vulnerable and you can, quote unquote, move a room, right? Each of those things. Or if you have served in any position in leadership, if you have been at the top of a pyramid, there are ways that you hold power that you're just unaware of. Who is going to speak up and challenge a status quo, or challenge an idea, or give you feedback that might be hard to hear? Who's going to tell you about the spinach in your teeth? There's ways that positional power plays into the dynamics of this. So you asked about a practical way that somebody could become aware of their power or engage with the marginalized or oppressed or people that they don't hear from. I had a class in seminary where the professor set up the conversation time. Every time, we're talking about reading and we're in groups and we share in the room. And he said, I really believe in God's kingdom that the last will be first and the first will be last. And so we're going to change the dynamics in the conversation. We're going to invite women of color to speak first, and then women, and then men of color. And we're going to ask the white men to speak last. And that might feel like, even hearing that might feel like there's a little bit of a rub. But people who had not otherwise been heard or spoken up began to speak first, and began to be heard, and began to feel safety and invitation to share. And this was such a small practical thing to just ask some people in the room to hold their thoughts and be first listeners, was how it was set up. And I'll never forget, at the end of this class, the guys in my class, all my kind of white guy friends, were like, the women in this class are remarkable. The things we have learned from the women in this class. And I was like, okay, you're telling on yourself now. So that's a really small way to say
Yeah.
who are the voices that are influencing me right now, whether that's around my dining room table, whether that's around my leadership table, whether that's on social media or authors that you're reading. How
Yeah.
many diverse perspectives are you able to assimilate into how you do what you do, or or incorporate into how you do what you do? So that might be one small way. And of course, there's all sorts of ways to connect either with folks in your church whose stories you may not hold,
Yeah.
or in your neighborhood, or other pastors in your community who, well, we're all navigating a really challenging time right now. The challenges my brothers and sisters of color are facing are different than the ones I'm facing. And so how do you get in proximity and create safe space for listening so that you can begin to safely and wisely move towards the marginalized or oppressed?
Yeah, I think that safe space is very important, that we have to engage and we have to listen. We have to be listeners first. And, that's why I love, that's why going back to always go back to Jesus. But when, even when Jesus was asked questions, he was asked, 187 questions or so. And he gave direct answers to, like, I don't know, maybe 3, 4, 5, something very minuscule, very small that he's giving direct answers to. He would often reflect back, ask a question towards the question asker, or tell a story. He would be very much engaged with the person that's in front of him, and not just be the answer man. We need to stop being the Bible answer man and just engage like Jesus engaged, and ask questions and listen to others. And it's not an easy thing to do. And one of the things I just, I listened to a podcast with Michael Lewis. It's called Against the Rules. But he talked about a study about men usually operate in about 30% overconfidence, meaning that they are going to just have a bias in their own mind saying that I actually think I know more than I actually know. And so they're going to operate higher. And women have about a 30% underconfidence, which they believe that they know about 30% less than they actually know and engage in. And even in that dynamic, it just got me thinking of, like, how do we interact as men and women in these leadership settings, or leading together, working together, doing this together, when there's a bias in our own mind as men saying we think we know more than we actually do, and women have a bias in their own mind that they think they know less than they actually do. And how do we grapple with that together?
Yes, it's such a good question. I think we have to grapple with that. And again, we even started out talking about culture. So a similar but different statistic is that young women's self-confidence peaks at 9 years old. And so I think there's something about this distinction between concrete and abstract thinking. Like, that's the age that you kind of change how you think. It's the age that women realize they're never going to live into all the expectations that culture or society has of them. It's the age that some of those messages become internalized about, like, don't take up too much space, don't rock the boat. Women are socialized and cultured to accommodate the needs around them, to, kind of make sure everybody is tended to tend to the emotional labor that's happening in the room. There's all these ways that women, and listen, as a parent, I can tell you I have parented my daughter and had different expectations than I have for my son. Like, that's how deeply ingrained it is in me. And so first, we just have to grow in our awareness and understanding of that. That idea of creating space to listen to women is a profound way to just begin to have men and women be able to hear one another.
Yeah.
I work with a lot of organizations that believe in women in leadership, but there's a gap. And it's because tradition gets in the way. So theologically, it's not an obstacle for them. And they're like, we wanted this to be brothers and sisters side by side, and it's not what happened. But there's all these ways we're cultured and socialized that we have to be aware of. So the same research that shows that women's self-confidence peaks at 9 years old talks about how, on the majority, women will not speak up unless they are asked or invited. So you think about a boardroom setting, and you think about how against the grain or countercultural it would be for a woman to speak up and be like, well, I have this crazy idea that's going to really mess up what we're doing, or even to give constructive feedback. So a really easy kind of handhold is just to ask the women in the room, if you're sitting around a boardroom table, to say, well, and Olivia, what do you think about that? Because women tend to need an invitation because of the way they're socialized to answer that. Some of the organizations that I work with get stuck in a space where they will have women around the table, but then want to sometimes sideline the perspective of women because it's challenging to the status quo. And so I think if the first step is getting women there and then inviting their feedback, I think the next level on the journey is to say, well, then what do we do with that if it's disruptive? Because women do tend to be more emotionally aware. To your point, in that confidence gap, they experience the world differently, and they have a different perspective. If your perspective has been predominantly men, and women are saying, hey, this decision lacks empathy, or who we're centering in the decision about COVID mitigations is probably not the right person, or what about these people that are going to be left out? That is disruptive. And so I think it's one step to get women around the table, but it's a second step to say, we wholly, fully value your contribution, and it's going to change what we do to have around this table. And so maybe there's some identification of where, a leader listening might feel like they get stuck, to be able to know what a good next step is for them.
I've trying, my wife and I are leading together. So we're co-executive directors of All Nations. And so we lead together, we work together, we're married, we parent together, we do a lot together. And so melding those two things together. But one of the things that I've noticed that I know that she is incredibly capable, and everybody around her knows that she's incredibly capable. And it takes more to muster up that confidence. And I think it's really just because that's how she's wired. Even though that she is much more capable than I am, and better at probably everything than I am. And I, tell her that it's hard for her to believe that. How can we instill confidence in women, even as we're listening and we're leading alongside and we're saying, yes, we want you in this, please engage. How do we instill that confidence so that we can get to a better space?
Yeah, so good. I do think it can be really hard for women to have confidence or to imagine what they haven't seen. And so that's one of the obstacles to getting more women in leadership positions. I think being as permission giving as possible to the women in your life, by calling out and naming the way you articulated our stance in that email, the way you responded with such care in your words, the way that you did the announcements on the weekend, I think affirming and then giving permission, giving opportunity, extending invitation for women to do, leading a board meeting with All Nations, or doing some kind of celebratory recognition of people who've made an impact this year, giving women airtime and affirming them, giving them permission to continue to step in, I think is a huge confidence builder. And like the developmental data would say, we grow in our competence when we grow in our competence. And so the way you grow in your competence is by doing, it's by studying, by finding, you find your voice by teaching, you find your voice by writing, you make a leadership decision. And sometimes it's the wrong decision, but you make it, and then you give feedback and you work through it, and you learn and make a better leadership decision next time. So anytime we can empower women, give women permission, help them find their own voice and find their agency, and then affirm that as it happens, I think that's how confidence around those gifts and strengths gets built. And if you're figuring out how to partner with your wife on that, I would imagine in moments that also means showing up as an ally in a meeting. You can read kind of the funny jokes about a woman throws out an idea and then a man says the idea, and then everybody's like, oh, that's a great idea. And you're like, she just said that. There's really kind and friendly ways to be like, Annette, I think you just said that, right? That was an awesome idea. That just helps balance things, because women will feel and notice that.
Yeah.
But when women call those things out, that's not always welcomed, right?
Yeah.
Or it's seen as prideful, or most often they don't even have the confidence to do it. So there's subtle ways that you can create space for women in those settings as an ally, because nobody's going to get upset if you call that out or
Yeah.
you encourage that or you challenge that. And so yeah, there's a way to show up and have an eye for how to be an ally and an advocate for the voices of women in the room. Heard.
That's that's really good. A lot of times, I want to shift a little bit and talk about church in culture. And to me, the church has been behind culture a lot. Like they're very reactive to culture and not proactive in the way that the church actually just walks in to a place and says, this is how we should interact with the world and come alongside us as we're interacting in the world. And we're going to show you a different way and a better way and a way that looks like Jesus. It's been a lot of reaction to what the culture has already done. How do we as the church step into that place of saying, hey, we want to show the world the way of Jesus, and it's actually going to be healthy and good for the entire culture around us?
Yeah. A couple of things come to mind as you ask that question, because I think that my experience of the church, it's been good at perhaps naming or teaching about the ways of Jesus. My experience of the church has not been great at embodying the ways of Jesus.
Right.
And I think, you read the statistics of 6 million millennials leaving the church since 2016. I think the cognitive dissonance of this gap of what we say versus what we do has become untenable for a lot of people. I think that's the challenge of why the church is in decline in the West. And I don't know that it's a bad thing, because that version of church probably does a disservice to the ways of God's kingdom. And so I think that idea of, if we were living into the ways of Jesus subversively, if we were finding ways to steward our influence, to steward our resources, if every Christian man I know was showing up to meetings the way that we just talked about that, we would be the most winsome people on the face of the planet. The men in the room would come to you after the meeting and say, thank you for helping me see that. I didn't know I do that. Women in the room. The women in the room would come to you and say, thank you for being a bridge builder and an advocate. And if we could be a people that leaned into mutuality between men and women, or that leaned into racial solidarity and showed up to the conversation for ways our brothers and sisters are still marginalized by racial hierarchies, then education, incarceration, healthcare, housing, if Christians could be people that lean into, and again, not in loud beat you over the head ways, but in subversive, loving ways that are invitational to people, we would become that city on the hill. We would have the most warm and winsome witness there ever was. And so I actually think this is so tied to even the conversation we had before of like the need for my answers as a senior pastor to be the absolute, or the need for me to have certainty and for you to agree with me. There's a lot of protecting in that. There's a lot of protection of Jesus. And I have found as a leader, when I can just create space for uncertainty and for people to be curious and for people to wrestle with things, even if they don't land in the exact same place that I do on the 7 core tenets of faith, or, I wasn't always there. I had to wrestle with these things too. So the more I can create just safe, loving space as a Christ follower, the way I imagine Jesus would have, the more transformational that becomes interpersonally. And I think the more that becomes our witness, the more transformational that becomes culturally. And maybe as I say that, the weight of that gap feels even greater right now.
Yeah. My wife and I just went to a place where we're hanging out with some people, and at the end she goes, I don't have a lot of confidence and hope for the American church at the moment, because she said we're not willing to suffer together, and the people who were able to suffer together and walk together in places where they may not agree, but they're able to walk together. That's where we're actually going to see health and growth and movement that is outward. But if we're wanting to be homogenous and only have uniformity so that we can agree one another, we're actually not going to be able to move forward. We're just going to stay in our status quo of who we are, and we're not going to actually shift and change and move. What do you say about that? The homogeneous uniformity versus the suffering together in our differences.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I fully agree. I think agreement is the cheapest form of unity, in quotes, that we could ever get. That there's just, that's the not the litmus test for unity
Yeah.
is agreement. I think when I come to that question of suffering, I wrestle with, what does that mean? What does that mean for me? What does that mean for people in our churches? I hear some Christians even today talking about, ways that they are persecuted. And I just think we're really far away from that, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
So when I just try to make this super practical, my kids go to a really great school, like they're 9s and 10s on the list. And the last week of school, I picked my son up and he had this bag, like a tote bag full of supplies and activities for us to do stuff this summer, books and a clock to tell time and cubes for math. And I mean, packed full of stuff. And I was like, is this because he is at risk and they're giving us resource? Like, what is this? And another parent was like, no, all the kids get it. It's just like summer family activities. And I'm thinking, there are kids 25 miles from me in the city that didn't have Chromebooks during COVID. There are kids that used cell phones in parking lots of Taco Bell to get Wi-Fi to do their class on Zoom. Like this disparity. So if you want to put under the bucket of suffering, like maybe my kids having less so that other kids in schools right down the road have adequate supplies for what they need, and that's considered a sacrifice on my part. Like, if that's what we mean, I think that's a really interesting conversation that Christians should be really engaged in right now. I have a hard time calling it suffering, but like that
right.
Versus how that term might get thrown around by Christians in the West right now. Right. So I think, to understand the pain or suffering of my brothers and sisters, and to be willing to show up to conversations where there's not equality and equity, and to be able to advocate for whoever is marginalized in our midst and front of us, even if that comes with the cost of suffering. I fully agree with that. And I think we have a long way to go to wrestle with that, right?
Yeah. Even, thinking about suffering, it's as practical as going on a mountain trekking trek with some other people. If you're in pain, you're walking together, you're working together, you're going to higher places than you have gone before, and you're not just settled in this nice and easy place. And so suffering not of, hey, I'm a victim, and that's not exactly what I want to talk about, but it's suffering together in I feel pain, and we're moving past a point of saying, I want to stay in the status quo and be, comfortable where I'm at.
And I think comfort is a huge value for us in the West, right? Like comfort and success and resources and wealth. And I think in ways that we don't even realize it, we are consistently seeking comfort, right? Whether that's to disconnect from the pain in front of us, or turn off the news, or leisure and activity and all those things that we have access to. And I just don't think that comfort is a value in the kingdom of God. And so I think we have to wrestle, to your point, we have to wrestle with that in this time for what is the invitation? What's the way of Jesus? And how do we show up and live into that, even if it is countercultural?
As we have actually been illuminated to the fact of who we are. We've been looking in the mirror of saying, oh, we look like this. I don't think we need to look like this. What hope do you have for the church in the West now?
Yeah. I have hope with the number of people who are wrestling right now. Like I actually am encouraged that in this moment, people are kind of calling out some of the areas of cognitive dissonance, are wrestling with, so much of what we saw over the last 2 years when it comes to racial issues, when it comes to economic disparities, when it comes to healthcare issues, when it comes to ways that capitalism is driving us. There's so much that again got highlighted. I think the fact that people are wrestling with, wait a minute, this isn't right, or this shouldn't be the priority, or that I've experienced in the church doesn't match the way of Jesus. I think that's a really good thing. That does give me hope, because it means that people are feeling the weight of what should be. I look at kind of the next generation, like Gen Z generation. They're the most kind of justice oriented, passionate generation. I think, man, if we can create runway for them to expand God's kingdom and do all of that for the sake of God's intention for the world of mutuality and flourishing, I have a ton of hope for what that can look like. I love that there are so many people like you having conversations about this. What does it mean to pace culture? What does it mean for us to have a winsome witness as the church in the West? And so I think even the truth telling that has happened sort of in our power structures in the church, I think that's a gift from God. I think the longer we kind of hide these things in the walls, the more or in our bodies, it's like a cancer, and it's going to spread and metastasize. But our willingness in, a lot of brave women and a lot of people who are telling their stories about harm in the church. And I was just seeing this week, like financial realities of Christian nonprofit organizations becoming, people having access to them and that becoming common knowledge. I think it's forcing us to really wrestle with, wait a minute, what should this be? And so I have a lot of hope for the ways that truth is being illuminated. And I think that's God's kindness to us, because we can't change until we're willing to deal with reality. And so this moment is ripe with hope and redemptive potential if we can be courageous enough to deal with reality and take steps forward towards Jesus.
Beautiful. A couple questions here at the end I'd like to ask. One is, if you could go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
Continue to challenge the world's expectations of you. Like there are ways now that I can see I kind of accommodated and acquiesced to what people expected of me as a nice young woman. And it's taken me, what's that, 17 years to try to really live into who I am, live into my body, live into my skin, own the voice God's given me. And so I would just encourage, I actually think it was some of my experience in conservative church that did that. And so I would just give myself some advice to really lean into and trust who God made me to be.
That's beautiful. Anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
I am loving the First Nations version of the New Testament.
Yes.
He gave me this as a gift. And I, over the last couple of years, have been just trying to explore my Indigenous roots more. And it's just been such a life-giving way to read God's word outside of maybe the way that I have read it in the past.
Oh, that's so good. Yeah, I was so excited when I saw that, and I saw that it was written. And so I'm glad that you're engaging with it and others are engaging with it. And it's a beautiful, beautiful work.
Powerful for me. I'm not really watching shows right now. I tried to get into Ted Lasso, but I'm wrapping up my thesis for seminary. And so TV is one of those things that I'm like, one day. Gonna join. I'm enjoying a couple different podcasts. The Inverse podcast, Jared McKenna and Drew Hart do. It's really, really been life-giving. I like Brene Brown's podcast a lot too.
Yeah. Excellent. Wonderful. Well, Keri, it was a pleasure to talk to you. And so thank you for being on, having this conversation. And I really think that, as we have hope for the future of the church, that we engage it, we reckon with where we've been and what we've done. And we say, hey, there is a better way. There's a Jesus way. And we need to embody Jesus going forward, that we're going to be in good shape because he's going to be the one that is leading and guiding. And hopefully we could see people that haven't had a voice have a voice in the kingdom, because that's what Jesus did. He gave voice to the voiceless. And so, I would love to see that. So thank you for showing us, leading us, and guiding us along the journey today. So thank you.
Joshua, thanks for having me. Thanks for what you do and for these rich conversations. It was a delight to be with you. And reach out if I can be a resource or you want to connect in any way.
Yeah, just briefly, if anybody wants to connect with you or anything that you have done and written, how can they do that?
Keri Lad on Instagram, or send me a friend request on Facebook. I did write a book called Together as a Team for Exponential. It's available on Amazon, or there's a free ebook download that really helps guide teams towards values-based leadership instead of kind of top-down vision-based leadership. Or New Ground Network. Send me an email. I'd love to connect with anybody who wants to have follow-up dialogue.
Perfect. Sounds good. Thank you so much, Keri.
Thanks, Joshua.
Bye. Thank you for listening to the show today. If you're really enjoying the show, please don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app. You could do it right now. Just hit that little plus. And then I would love it if you would leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. So you could go right now to the show and leave a star rating and review, and let us know how you are enjoying the show. And find us on Facebook and Instagram. So if you want to connect, interact, I post a lot of quotes and different things that you could actually interact with the episodes, and let me know how you are enjoying the show. If you feel inclined to donate, there is a support the show link in the show notes, and it would send you directly to a page where you could donate so that new episodes can be produced for your enjoyment. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have an incredible week.